Hey everyone, welcome back to Beast History. Today, we're tearing down one of the most iconic, most badass, and most misunderstood images in all of history. We're talking about the samurai, and we're going to do it by asking a question that sounds like pure heresy. It sounds like fighting words. The question is, why were the samurai actually terrible swordsmen? Okay, take a breath. Before you type that angry comment, let me be crystal clear. This title is a deliberate provocation. It's a key designed to unlock a door you might not have known was there. Because behind that door is a story that is infinitely more complex, more surprising, and frankly, more interesting than the one we've all been sold. We all know the image, right? It's burned into our collective consciousness. A lone warrior clad in dark, silent armor. His hand rests on the hilt of a katana, a blade so perfect it's said to be an extension of his very soul. In a flash of steel, he cuts down 10, 20, 50 lesser men. He is the living embodiment of the sword. This image is powerful, it's poetic, it's romantic, and for the vast majority of samurai history, it is almost completely wrong. The truth is, the legend of the sword saint samurai has almost completely erased the reality of what these warriors actually were for centuries. The story of the samurai is not the story of the sword. The sword was a footnote. It was a sidearm. It was a last resort. For a samurai to draw his katana on a battlefield, it usually meant one thing, that everything had already gone catastrophically wrong. The real story of the samurai, the one that built their power, won their wars, and forged their identity for over 1,000 years, was dominated by two other weapons. First, a 7-foot-long asymmetrical bow, and second, a simple, brutal, and terrifyingly effective spear. So today, we are going to deconstruct the myth. We're going to peel back the layers of cinema, philosophy, and nationalist propaganda to find the warrior underneath. We'll see how the original samurai would be almost unrecognizable to us today, looking more like flamboyant, peacocking archers on horseback than stoic ninjas. We'll see how the blood-soaked battlefields of Japan's civil wars were ruled not by elegant swordplay, but by bristling walls of peasant spearmen. And we will see how the legend of the sword was forged not in the heat of battle, but in the long, strange, and anxious quiet of peace. This isn't a story about debunking a myth just for the sake of it. It's a story about how history gets written, how legends are made, and how the identity of one of the world's most famous warrior classes was completely reinvented. So let's begin. Forget everything you think you know. Let's go back to the beginning, to a time before the katana was king, to meet the original samurai. To find him, we have to travel back, way back. Past the epic movies, past the duels of Miyamoto Musashi, past the Warring States period. We have to go back to Japan's Heian period, an era that stretches from the late 8th to the late 12th century. This was a time of supposed peace and sublime courtly culture, centered in the magnificent capital, modern-day Kyoto. Here, the emperor was a divine figurehead, and the real power was in the hands of sophisticated, poetry-writing aristocrats from the Fujiwara clan. They were obsessed with aesthetic beauty, with the proper fold of a robe, the right choice of scented wood, the perfect calligraphic stroke. It was a world of incredible refinement. But out in the provinces, far from the perfumed halls of the capital, a different kind of power was growing. This is where we find our first samurai, and the word itself gives us a clue: samurai. It comes from the verb saburao, which means to serve or to wait upon. They were, in essence, the hired muscle of the Heian court nobles. They were provincial warriors, often distant relatives of the fancy aristocrats in the capital, tasked with collecting taxes, putting down rebellions, and generally handling the dirty work of managing a large country. But if you have an image in your head of a silent, grim-faced warrior in black, you need to throw it out the window. The original samurai of the Heian period was anything but subtle. He was an explosion of color and arrogance. He was an aristocrat on horseback, and his entire identity was built around proving it. Imagine him. He's not on foot, he's on a prized warhorse, a small but powerful animal bred for stamina and agility. His armor isn't the sleek, form-fitting suit you might be thinking of. It's a massive, boxy suit called an oyori, which translates to great armor. It's crafted from thousands of tiny scales of leather and iron, all laced together with vibrant silk cords of orange, blue, and white. It's less of a suit of armor and more like a wearable fortress, with huge, rectangular shoulder guards that stick out like armored wings. On his head is a helmet, an iron bowl adorned with sweeping, antler-like crests or kuwagata, often made of gleaming brass. He might even have a terrifying iron mask, or mempo, with a snarling metal mouth and a bristling horsehair mustache. This man was not trying to be stealthy. He was a billboard, a walking, riding, shouting declaration of his own power, wealth, and heroic status. And the source of that status, the core of his martial identity, was not the blade at his hip. It was the weapon in his hands. It was the yumi, the uniquely Japanese longbow. These early samurai, the founders of a warrior tradition that would last a millennium, defined themselves by one single martial creed. It wasn't the way of the sword. It was kyuuba no mechai, the way of the horse and bow. This was their religion, their art, and their reason for being. The sword was there, of course. A long, deeply curved blade called a takai was slung from his belt, but we'll get to that later. For now, all that mattered was the horse under him and the bow in his hand. Before the samurai was a swordsman, he was a cavalry archer, and he was one of the most skilled and deadly cavalry archers the world has ever seen. To understand the samurai, you have to understand this holy trinity, the horse, the armor, and the bow. And you have to understand how they all work together to create a single, terrifyingly effective fighting system. Let's start with the weapon that defined this era, the yumi. This is not your typical bow. If you've ever seen a picture of one, you'll immediately notice something strange about it. It's asymmetrical. The grip isn't in the center. It's about 1/3 of the way up from the bottom. This looks bizarre, but it was a stroke of absolute genius born from necessity. The standard Japanese bow was incredibly long, often over 2 meters, or close to 7 feet. Trying to wield a bow that long on horseback would be a nightmare. It would constantly get tangled in the horse's neck and mane. By placing the grip lower down, the samurai could sweep the long upper limb of the bow over the horse's head with ease, while the shorter lower limb cleared the saddle and the horse's flank. It allowed for maximum power from a long stave in the tight, chaotic confines of mounted combat. These bows were also masterpieces of composite construction. They were made from laminated strips of bamboo and wood, glued together in a complex process that took incredible skill. This design gave the bow a powerful, reflex-action draw and a devastating range, capable of piercing the thick armor of the time from a significant distance. The arrows, or ya, were just as specialized. They were long shafts of bamboo with feathers from eagles or hawks, and tipped with a variety of cruel-looking iron heads. The most famous was the turnip head arrowhead, a large, V-shaped point that was designed to cause maximum damage. But there were also whistling arrows with a perforated wooden bulb for a head. These made a terrifying, shrieking sound as they flew through the air. They weren't just for killing, they were for signaling, for psychological warfare. The first sound of a samurai attack was often not a battle cry, but the ungodly scream of a dozen whistling arrows descending on your position. It was the sound of impending doom. Mastering this weapon was a life's work. A young samurai would begin his training as a child, learning to shoot from a standing position, then from his knees, and finally from the back of a moving horse. He would practice for hours every day, firing thousands of arrows until the act of knocking, drawing, and releasing was as natural as breathing. There were specialized forms of training, like yabusame, a ritual form of mounted archery where the samurai would gallop at full speed down a narrow track, firing blunt arrows at 3 small wooden targets. It was a test of supreme skill, a perfect synthesis of horsemanship and marksmanship. To hit one target at a gallop was impressive. To hit all three was the mark of a true master. This was the pinnacle of the samurai art form. This was what they valued. This was what made a warrior a hero. Now, let's go back to that big, boxy armor, the Oyor. At first glance, it looks clumsy. It doesn't seem to offer the kind of agility you'd associate with a nimble fighter. And you'd be right, because it wasn't designed for a nimble fighter on the ground. It was designed for a man sitting on a horse, holding a bow. The entire suit was essentially built around the act of archery. Think about it. The armor is heavy, but most of its weight rests on the shoulders and is then distributed down onto the saddle of the horse. The warrior wasn't bearing the full weight himself. The broad, stiff construction created a stable platform. The huge, wing-like shoulder guards, the sword, weren't just for show. When the samurai raised his arms to draw the bow, these guards provided a shield for his exposed upper arms and armpits, protecting him from enemy arrows coming in from the side. The cuirass, the main body armor, was open on one side, laced together with silk cords. This might seem like a weakness, but it made the armor easier to put on and take off, and allowed for more flexibility in the torso for twisting and turning to shoot in different directions. The front of the cuirass was covered with a leather panel, the tsurubashiri, which translates to bowstring running. Its purpose was simple, to provide a smooth, snag-free surface for the bowstring to move across when the arrow was released. Every element of the design points back to the bow. It was a mobile archery platform, a personal tank for a mounted archer. The helmet, or kabuto, was a heavy iron bowl with a wide, riveted neck guard that flared out to protect the back and sides of the neck. It was designed to deflect downward blows and, most importantly, incoming arrows. So what about the sword? It was there, hanging from his belt. This early sword, the takai, was different from the later, more famous katana. It was typically longer and more deeply curved. Crucially, it was worn suspended from the belt with the cutting edge facing down. Why? Again, it was all about the horse. A long, curved blade worn edge down is much easier to draw from horseback than a blade worn edge up, tucked into the sash. It was designed to be unsheathed with a sweeping, downward motion, perfect for a rider slashing down at infantry on the ground. The takai was a potent weapon, a beautifully crafted piece of steel, and a vital symbol of the samurai's status. But on the battlefield, it was Plan B or maybe even Plan C. The primary game was to stay on your horse and fill the enemy with arrows from a distance. If an enemy got too close, you'd use the bow to try and knock them down or disable them. If your spear-wielding retainers on foot couldn't handle them, and they swarmed your horse, only then, in that moment of desperation, would you abandon your bow, draw your takai, and fight for your life in close quarters. It was a backup weapon, a sidearm for a crisis. The entire philosophy of battle in this period was different. It wasn't about disciplined formations and grand strategy. It was about a series of individual, heroic encounters. A battle would often begin with a ritual exchange of archery. The two sides would line up, and their most celebrated warriors would ride forward. They would loudly announce their name, their lineage, and their past deeds of glory, a kind of formal, pre-battle trash talk. Then they would fire their whistling arrows to signal the start of hostilities, and the main battle would commence. It was a chaotic swirl of mounted warriors, each seeking out a worthy opponent to engage in a personal duel of horse and bow. The goal was to score a prestigious kill, to take the head of a famous enemy warrior as a trophy. This was how reputations were made. This was how a samurai earned honor, and honor was everything. The greatest tales of this era, the legends that were told and retold for generations, were not about incredible swordsmen. They were about almost supernaturally gifted archers. And nowhere is this more clear than in the epic conflict that closed the Heian period and gave birth to the first samurai government, the Genpei War. The Genpei War, which raged from 1180 to 1185, was a brutal, nation-spanning civil war that pitted the two most powerful samurai clans against each other, the Taira and the Minamoto. It was the bloody climax of decades of rising tension between the provincial warrior class and the old court aristocracy. In essence, the samurai were tired of being the hired help. They wanted to run the show themselves, and this war would decide who got the prize. It was a conflict that would become the foundational epic of the samurai, their equivalent of the Trojan War, filled with heroes, villains, tragedy, and incredible feats of martial prowess. And those feats were almost entirely acts of archery. The chronicles of this war, like the epic poem The Tale of the Hike, are a highlight reel of legendary archers. There's the story of Minamoto no Tamitomo, a warrior of almost mythical stature. He was said to be over 7 feet tall, with an arm so long and powerful that he could draw a bow that required the strength of 2 or 3 normal men. The stories claim his arrows were so massive and flew with such force that he once sank a Taira ship by firing a single arrow through its hull below the waterline. This is almost certainly an exaggeration, but the fact that this is the legend that survived tells you everything you need to know about what these people valued. They weren't telling tall tales about a man who could cut a ship in half with his sword. They were telling tales about a man who could sink it with a bow. But perhaps the single most famous story from the entire Genpei War, the one scene that perfectly captures the absolute supremacy of the bow in the samurai imagination, is the story of Nasu no Yoichi at the Battle of Yashima. The year is 1184. The Minamoto clan has driven the Taira from the capital and cornered them on the island of Shikoku. The Taira forces are on their ships just offshore, while the Minamoto army is arrayed on the beach. It's a standoff. The sun is beginning to set, casting a long, golden light over the water. In a gesture of courtly defiance, the Taira send out a small, unpowered boat. On the bow of the boat, a beautiful lady-in-waiting raises a long pole. At the very top of the pole, she places a red fan decorated with a golden sun. It's a taunt, a challenge. The Taira are essentially saying, "We are the true inheritors of the court. We have the emperor. This fan represents him. If you think you're so great, try and shoot it. We dare you." The fan, bobbing on the waves hundreds of feet away, is a ridiculously small target. It's a moving target, swaying with the rhythm of the sea. Hitting it seems impossible. It's a deliberate attempt to humiliate the Minamoto warriors. The Minamoto commander, Yoshitsune, one of the most brilliant and tragic figures in Japanese history, looks for his best archer. He finds a young warrior named Nasu no Yoichi. At first, Yoichi is hesitant. He says he's not sure he can make the shot, and if he misses, it will bring eternal shame upon his lord and the entire Minamoto clan. The risk is immense, but Yoshitsune insists. This is not just about hitting a target, it's a battle of wills, a test of legitimacy. Failure is not an option, so Nasu no Yoichi rides his horse out into the surf. The water comes up to his horse's belly. He readies his yumi. He takes a single arrow from his quiver. The Tale of the Hike describes the scene with breathtaking detail. It says Yoichi closed his eyes and prayed. He prayed to Hachiman, the god of war and the divine protector of the Minamoto clan. He said, "Let me not miss. If I miss, I will break my bow and take my own life, for I will be unfit to ever serve a lord again." He is staking his life, his honor, everything on this single shot. He opens his eyes. He gauges the wind and the gentle swell of the waves. He raises his massive bow, knocks the arrow, and draws the string back to his ear. For a moment, everyone on the shore and on the ships holds their breath. The world goes silent, save for the lapping of the waves. And then he lets the arrow fly. The arrow soars in a perfect arc across the water, a thin black line against the setting sun. It flies true. It doesn't just hit the fan. It strikes the tiny metal rivet at the fan's pivot point. The sound of the impact cracks across the water. The fan leaps into the air, spins in the evening light, and then flutters down into the sea. The arrow continues on its path and buries itself in the water beyond. For a second, there is stunned silence. And then, both armies, Minamoto and Terra alike, erupt. The Minamoto warriors on the shore start banging on their quivers in a rhythmic, thunderous applause. Even the enemy Terra soldiers on their ships are so impressed by this display of pure, godlike skill that they too begin to cheer. In that one moment, with one arrow, Nasuno Yoichi has not only met the challenge, he has transcended it. He has proven the martial superiority of the Minamoto in a way no speech or charge could. It is a moment of pure, unadulterated legend. This is the story that became the archetype of samurai heroism for centuries. The hero of the Genpei War, the foundational epic of the samurai class, is not a swordsman. He is an archer. His defining moment is not a desperate melee, but a long-range shot of impossible precision. This was the ideal. This was the warrior they aspired to be. For nearly 400 years, from their origins in the Heian period through the Kamakura period that followed the Genpei War, the identity of the samurai was inextricably linked to the horse and the bow. It was the foundation of their military power, their social status, and their very soul. But history never stands still. The world changes, and the nature of war changes with it. And in the late 13th century, a new threat appeared on the horizon. A storm from the west that would challenge everything the samurai believed about themselves and how they fought. This new enemy fought in a way the samurai had never seen before. They didn't engage in heroic single combat. They didn't announce their lineage before a battle. They moved in disciplined, silent formations. They used massed volleys of poisoned arrows, hurled explosives, and operated as a terrifyingly efficient, coordinated killing machine. They were the Mongols. When the Great Khan's invasion fleets arrived in 1274 and again in 1281, they presented the samurai with a horrifying tactical problem. The traditional Japanese method of fighting, this series of individual archery duels, was borderline useless against the disciplined, combined arms tactics of the Mongol invaders. The samurai would ride forward to announce his name and challenge a worthy opponent, only to be pincushioned by a volley of arrows from a dozen anonymous soldiers who simply did not care about his honor or his famous grandfather. It was a brutal, shocking education in a new kind of warfare. The samurai ultimately repelled the Mongols, thanks in large part to a pair of luckily timed typhoons the Japanese would call the kamikaze, or divine wind. But the experience left a deep psychological scar. It proved that their traditional way of war was not invincible. It could be beaten. And this brings us to a fascinating turning point, a moment of crisis for an entire warrior class. And I want to turn this question over to you. You are a high-ranking samurai commander in the wake of the Mongol invasions. You've just witnessed your culture's entire military philosophy, the glorious way of the horse and bow, get systematically dismantled by a foreign, brutally efficient enemy. Your entire identity, your honor, and your idea of what makes a great warrior is tied to this tradition of heroic, individual combat. But you know deep down that it's not the most effective way to win a large-scale battle anymore. You now have a choice. Do you double down on tradition? Do you insist that the honorable way, the way of your ancestors, is the only true way, even if it's tactically inferior? Or do you make the pragmatic choice? Do you start to abandon the beautiful, heroic ideal of single combat and adopt new, grittier, and more effective group tactics to ensure survival and victory in the future? Do you sacrifice your identity for effectiveness? It's a brutal decision. What would you have done in his shoes? Let me know your honest opinion in the comments below. Because the choice that Japan's warriors made in the centuries to come would plunge the country into its bloodiest and most transformative era, an age where the bow would be sidelined, and a new, far more humble weapon would become the undisputed king of the battlefield. The Mongol invasions were a shock to the system, a brutal wake-up call. They didn't completely shatter the samurai's devotion to the bow overnight, but they planted a seed of doubt. They demonstrated in the most violent way possible that individual heroism had its limits. They proved that a coordinated group of disciplined soldiers, even if they were individually less skilled or of a lower social status, could defeat a collection of brilliant individuals. This lesson would simmer under the surface of Japanese society for another half-century. And then, in the middle of the 14th century, the system that had maintained a fragile peace for generations finally cracked. The shogunate, the military government established by the Minamoto after the Genpei War, began to lose its grip on the country. Its authority withered. Powerful regional clans, sensing weakness at the center, began to ignore the shogun's decrees and assert their own power. Japan was sliding toward anarchy, and by the mid-15th century, it fell headlong into the abyss. This marks the beginning of the most famous, most violent, and most iconic period in samurai history, the Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States. For the next 150 years, from roughly 1467 to the early 1600s, Japan was not a unified country. It was a chaotic, constantly shifting patchwork of dozens, sometimes hundreds of independent domains, each ruled by a powerful warlord, a daimyo, who was locked in a perpetual life-or-death struggle with his neighbors. The concept of loyalty to a central government in Kyoto was a joke. The only law was the law of the sword, or rather, the law of the spear. This was a new kind of war. The small-scale clashes between elite, aristocratic horse archers that defined the Genpei War were a thing of the past. The Sengoku Jidai was an era of total war. Battles were no longer fought by a few hundred samurai on each side. They were fought by massive armies, sometimes numbering 50, 70, or even 100,000 men. Warlords weren't just fighting for honor or to settle a clan dispute. They were fighting for survival and for the ultimate prize, the unification of all of Japan under their own rule. It was a brutal, Darwinian free-for-all, a Game of Thrones played with a level of ruthlessness that would make George R.R. Martin blush. Fortunes were made and lost overnight. A minor lord could become a provincial ruler in a single, brilliant battle. A mighty clan that had ruled for centuries could be extinguished in an afternoon. This radical change in the scale and intensity of warfare demanded a radical change in the composition of armies. An ambitious daimyo couldn't win by relying solely on a small number of elite, highly trained, and very expensive mounted samurai. The math just didn't work. To field an army of 20,000, you needed bodies, lots of them. And that meant turning to the vast, untapped reservoir of manpower that made up 90% of Japan's population, the peasantry. This is where a new figure strides onto the stage of Japanese history and completely changes the game. He is the Ashigaru, which literally means Lightfoot. The Ashigaru were the foot soldiers of the Sengoku period. They were not samurai. They had no noble lineage, no fancy armor, and for the most part, no formal martial arts training. They were farmers, laborers, and sometimes just bandits, who were either conscripted into a daimyo's army or who signed up voluntarily for the promise of regular pay, a little bit of loot, and a chance to escape the crushing poverty of village life. In the beginning, these peasant levies were poorly equipped and unreliable, often little more than a disorganized mob. But as the wars dragged on and the stakes got higher, the more successful daimyo realized that the Ashigaru were not just cannon fodder. They were the key to victory. Warlords like the brilliant Takeda Shinjin and the revolutionary Oda Nobunaga began to organize their Ashigaru into disciplined, professional units. They gave them standardized equipment, drilled them relentlessly, and integrated them into a coherent battle plan. They transformed the Ashigaru from a rabble into a real army. And what weapon did they give these tens of thousands of new soldiers? It wasn't the bow. The Yumi was a specialist's weapon that took years of dedicated training to master. The average farmer couldn't just pick one up and be an effective archer. It definitely wasn't the sword. A quality katana was an expensive, handcrafted work of art, a status symbol reserved for the samurai class. Giving a sword to a peasant was like giving a Rolex to a factory worker. It was economically unfeasible and socially unthinkable. No, the weapon they gave the ashigaru was cheap to produce, easy to use with a minimum of training, and when used correctly, almost unbeatable on the battlefield. They gave them the yari, the spear, and so began the reign of the spear. For the 150 years of the Sengoku Jidai, the yari was the true king of the Japanese battlefield. It was the weapon that won the wars, that built the empires, and that decided the fate of the nation. The mounted samurai archer, the hero of the Genpei War, was now a relic. He was still a prestigious part of the army, an elite shock trooper or a commander's bodyguard, but he was no longer the decisive element. The decisive element was now a block of anonymous peasants holding a 10 to 15 foot long sharpened pole. Why was the spear so dominant? The answer is simple and brutal: reach and formation. A man with a 6-foot sword, no matter how skilled he is at a massive disadvantage against a man with a 12-foot spear. The spearman can kill the swordsman from twice the distance. It's a simple, unforgiving law of physics. Now multiply that by 1,000. Imagine a samurai warrior, even a master swordsman, charging toward the enemy line. He doesn't face one spearman. He faces a solid wall of them, a hedgehog of glittering steel points, 3 or 4 ranks deep. The men in the front rank have their spears leveled. The men in the second rank have theirs angled over the shoulders of the men in front, and so on. It's a forest of death. There is simply no way for a single swordsman, or even a small group of them, to break through that formation. To even get close enough to use his sword, he has to get past the lethal points of multiple spears. It's a suicide mission. The spear wall was the great equalizer of the Sengoku battlefield. It nullified the superior individual skill of the samurai. It didn't matter how fast you were with a blade, how many duels you had won, or how famous your name was. Against a disciplined block of ashigaru with yari, you were just another body about to be skewered. The yari itself came in many forms. The simplest was the su-yari, a straight, leaf-shaped blade on a long shaft of hardened wood or bamboo. But there were more complex designs, like the jumanji yari, which had 2 smaller curved blades branching out from the base of the central one, like a cross. This was an incredibly versatile weapon. You could thrust with the central point. You could use the side blades to parry an opponent's weapon, or you could use them to hook a mounted samurai's armor and drag him from his horse. In the hands of a trained ashigaru, it was a brutally efficient tool. The training was also far simpler than for any other weapon. You didn't need years of practice to be an effective part of a spear unit. You needed to know how to stand your ground, how to point the sharp end toward the enemy, how to thrust in unison with the men next to you, and how to not break and run when the enemy charged. It was about group discipline, not individual artistry. It was the warfare of the collective, a stark rejection of the individualistic ethos of the early samurai. The greatest warlords of the age were the ones who mastered this new reality, and no one understood it better and exploited it more ruthlessly than the man who would come closer than anyone to conquering Japan, Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga is one of the most compelling figures in all of Japanese history. He was a brilliant, ambitious, and often terrifyingly cruel daimyo from the minor province of Owari. He had a reputation for bizarre behavior, for showing up to formal ceremonies in peasant clothes, for casting aside tradition whenever it got in his way. The old guard of conservative samurai thought he was a fool, an upstart with no respect for the old ways. They were dead wrong. Nobunaga wasn't a fool, he was a visionary. He saw the future of warfare, and it was a future built on peasants, spears, and a new, even more revolutionary weapon, the firearm. The story of how Nobunaga used these new tools to demolish his more traditional rivals is perfectly encapsulated in one of the most audacious gambles in military history. The Battle of Okezama in the year 1560. At the time, Nobunaga was a minor, insignificant lord. His enemy, Imagawa Yashimoto, was one of the most powerful daimyo in Japan. Yashimoto had assembled a massive army, estimated at around 25,000 men, to march on the capital, Kyoto, and declare himself shogun. Nobunaga's lands in Owari lay directly in the path of this military juggernaut. To face this invasion, Nobunaga could only muster a tiny force of about 2,000 to 3,000 men. The odds were not just bad, they were impossible. 10 to 1. His advisors were in a panic. They begged him to stay behind his castle walls, to surrender, to do anything other than face Yashimoto's army in the open field. It would be an annihilation. But Nobunaga was not a man who played by the rules. He had excellent intelligence reports. He knew Yashimoto's army was overconfident, celebrating their initial victories and advancing in a long, strung-out column. And he knew that the main prize, Yashimoto himself, had set up camp in a narrow, wooded gorge called Dengaku-Heizama. Yashimoto and his core samurai retainers were feasting, drinking sake, and enjoying theatrical performances, convinced that the war was already won. Nobunaga made a decision that seemed like pure madness. He would not defend. He would attack. He left a token force of men at his castle with a forest of banners to create the illusion of a large army, and then he secretly marched the bulk of his small force on a long, circuitous route to get behind the Imagawa main camp. As they got close, a stroke of incredible luck intervened. The heavens opened up. A massive thunderstorm and torrential downpour swept across the battlefield. The rain was so intense it masked the sound and movement of Nobunaga's troops as they took up their positions on a hill overlooking the gorge. The Imagawa army, soaked and miserable, hunkered down, completely oblivious to the doom that was about to descend upon them. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the rain stopped. The sun broke through the clouds, and Nobunaga gave the order. His entire army, a mere 2,000 men, charged down the hill and smashed directly into the center of the Imagawa camp. The attack was a complete surprise. The Imagawa forces were in chaos. Their men were scattered, their armor was off, their weapons were wet. They had no idea what was happening. They thought it was a drunken brawl that had broken out among their own troops. Nobunaga's soldiers, a mix of samurai and disciplined Ashigaru spearmen, were a whirlwind of destruction. They weren't interested in duels or honorable combat. They had one objective: find and kill Imagawa Yashimoto. The fighting was a desperate, muddy, bloody melee. Yashimoto, woken from his drunken stupor, thought the noise was just his own men fighting. By the time he realized it was an enemy attack, it was too late. He was surrounded. According to the chronicles, he fought back, cutting down several attackers with his prized sword, but he was overwhelmed. A samurai in Nobunaga's army finally cut him down, and another took his head. When news of Yashimoto's death spread through the Imagawa army, what was left of their morale shattered completely. The massive invasion force dissolved. Men threw down their weapons and fled. In the space of a few hours, Oda Nobunaga had gone from a minor provincial lord on the verge of annihilation to one of the most powerful and feared men in Japan. He had won not with superior numbers, but with superior intelligence, terrifying audacity, and a disciplined force of Ashigaru spearmen who knew how to strike at the enemy's heart. Okezama was a turning point. It was a brutal demonstration that the old way of war was dead. Arrogance, tradition, and numerical superiority were no match for strategy, discipline, and surprise. Okezama was won with spears, but Nobunaga was already perfecting an even more potent combination. A few years earlier, in the 1540s, Portuguese traders had arrived in Japan, bringing with them a weapon that would change the country forever: the arquebus, a type of matchlock firearm. The Japanese, who were master metalworkers, immediately recognized the potential of this new technology. They began manufacturing their own version, called the Tangashima. Nobunaga, with his love of new and effective technology, embraced firearms with an enthusiasm that his more conservative rivals lacked. He equipped a significant portion of his ashigaru with guns. He understood that a single arquebus was slow to load and inaccurate. But he also understood that 1,000 of them, firing in coordinated volleys, were a weapon of terrifying power. His masterpiece was the Battle of Nagashino in 1575. There, he faced the legendary cavalry of the Taikta clan, widely considered the most powerful and fearsome samurai army in Japan. Instead of meeting their famous cavalry charge in the open, Nobunaga did something revolutionary. He built a long, zigzagging wooden palisade, a simple fence, across the plain. Behind this fence, he stationed 3,000 of his ashigaru armed with Tangashima. He arranged them in 3 ranks. As the Taikta cavalry charged, the first rank of ashigaru fired a massive volley. Then, as they stepped back to begin the slow, multi-step process of reloading, the second rank stepped forward and fired. Then the third. By the time the third rank had fired, the first was reloaded and ready to fire again. It was a continuous rolling thunder of gunfire. The Taikta cavalry, the pride of Japan, charged again and again into this storm of lead. Their charges, which had shattered so many other armies, broke against Nobunaga's simple wooden fence and his disciplined ranks of peasant gunmen. The result was a slaughter. The Taikta army was not just defeated, it was annihilated. Its legendary cavalry was destroyed, and its power was broken forever. Nagashino was the final nail in the coffin of the old way of war. It proved that a well-drilled unit of low-born peasants with spears and firearms could systematically destroy the most elite, most heroic, and most prestigious samurai cavalry in the land. So in this maelstrom of violence, this new world of massive armies, peasant soldiers, spear walls, and gunfire, where did the katana fit in? What was the role of the sword, the supposed soul of the samurai? Its role was deeply personal, often desperate, and almost entirely secondary. The katana was a sidearm. It was the weapon a samurai fell back on when his primary weapon, which by this point was often a spear himself, as samurai commanders frequently fought on foot alongside their men, was lost or broken. Think of it like a modern soldier's sidearm, their pistol. A soldier's primary weapon is his rifle. That's what he uses for the main part of a firefight. He only draws his pistol in very specific, usually very bad, situations. Maybe his rifle has jammed. Maybe he's fighting in a room so small that the rifle is too clumsy to use. Maybe he's been wounded and can only fight with one hand. Drawing your pistol means you're in deep trouble. For the Sengoku samurai, drawing the katana on the battlefield often meant the same thing. It meant the spear formations had broken. It meant the battle had devolved into a chaotic, swirling melee where long weapons were a liability. It meant you were fighting for your life in the mud and blood, surrounded by enemies. Or it meant you were storming a castle, fighting hand-to-hand in the narrow confines of a corridor or a courtyard where a long spear was useless. In these situations, the katana was a magnificent weapon. It was exquisitely designed for cutting, a masterpiece of steel capable of shearing through limbs and armor with terrifying efficiency. A skilled samurai with a katana in a close-quarters fight was a deadly opponent, but the key phrase here is close quarters. To get to that point, the entire strategic and tactical fabric of the battle had to fall apart. The sword was the weapon of the chaotic aftermath, not the weapon of the planned engagement. Its moments of glory were born from the failure of the primary plan. So, the image of the samurai single-handedly cutting down waves of enemies on an open battlefield is a fantasy. That samurai would have been impaled on a dozen spears long before he ever got the chance to draw his famous blade. The true face of Sengoku warfare wasn't the elegant dance of the sword. It was the brutal, collective push of the spear wall and the deafening roar of the arquebus. The samurai of this era were not primarily swordsmen. They were commanders, they were strategists, they were horsemen, they were spearmen, and they were even gunmen. They were pragmatic, adaptable, and ruthless survivors in a world of constant war. The sword was an important part of their identity, a symbol of their status, and a life-saving tool in a pinch. But it wasn't what won the wars. The wars were won by the humble, unglamorous, and utterly dominant spear. And after more than a century of unrelenting bloodshed, the wars would finally end. Japan would be unified. And in the long, strange peace that followed, the samurai would face their greatest crisis yet, a crisis of purpose. And it was in this crisis that the myth of the sword would truly be born. After Oda Nobunaga's brilliant and brutal career was cut short by betrayal, his mission to unify Japan was taken up by two of his most capable successors. First came Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man of peasant origins who had risen through the ranks with sheer talent and charisma. Hideyoshi completed the military conquest of Japan, subjugating the last of the defiant clans. When Hideyoshi died, his power was usurped by the shrewdest and most patient of all the great unifiers, Tokugawa Ieyasu. In the year 1600, at the titanic Battle of Sekigahara, the largest samurai battle in history, Ieyasu crushed his rivals and established himself as the undisputed master of Japan. 3 years later, in 1603, the emperor granted him the title of shogun. The Tokugawa shogunate was born, and the Sengoku Jidai, the century and a half of ceaseless, bloody warfare, was finally over. What Tokugawa Ieyasu created was a masterpiece of political engineering. He established a system of centralized feudalism that was designed, above all else, to ensure one thing: stability. He wanted to make sure that a period like the Warring States could never, ever happen again. The Tokugawa shogunate imposed a rigid social hierarchy, with the samurai class at the very top. They froze the social order. A peasant was a peasant, a merchant was a merchant, and a samurai was a samurai. There would be no more ambitious peasants like Hideyoshi rising to rule the country. They implemented a policy of sakoku, or closed country, severely restricting foreign trade and travel to prevent destabilizing influences like Christianity from getting a foothold. They perfected a system of control over the daimyo, forcing them to spend every other year in the capital city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, and to leave their families there as permanent hostages when they returned to their own domains. It was a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. And it worked. For the next 265 years, from 1603 to 1868, Japan experienced an era of almost unbroken domestic peace and stability. Historians call it the Edo period, and it was a time of incredible cultural and economic flourishing. Cities grew, commerce thrived, and a vibrant urban culture of theater, art, and literature emerged. But for the ruling class, for the samurai, this long peace presented a profound and deeply unsettling paradox. It was an existential crisis. The samurai were a warrior class. Their entire identity, their social standing, their privileges, and their sense of self-worth were all rooted in the practice of war. And now, there were no more wars to fight. What do you do with 1 million professional soldiers in a country that is suddenly, stubbornly at peace? The Tokugawa government found a new job for them. They transformed the samurai from warriors into a hereditary caste of civil administrators. The men whose grandfathers had been charging enemy lines with spears and taking heads on the battlefield were now bureaucrats. They were shuffling paper in castle towns, managing rice stipends, overseeing public works projects, and acting as a kind of feudal police force. They were still allowed to wear their 2 swords, the long katana and the shorter companion sword, the wakizashi. This right, known as daisho, became the ultimate status symbol, the one thing that visibly separated them from the commoners. But for the most part, these swords were never drawn in anger. They were just part of the uniform. Imagine the psychological dislocation. You are trained from birth to be a warrior. You are told stories of your heroic ancestors. Your entire reason for being is tied to concepts of martial valor, of honor earned in battle, of a glorious death. And you spend your entire life sitting at a desk, reviewing tax ledgers. It was a recipe for profound anxiety. The samurai of the Edo period were, in a very real sense, a class of unemployed warriors, haunted by a glorious past that they could never participate in. And it is precisely in this context, in this long, boring piece, that the cult of the sword truly begins. With no practical battlefield application left, the katana was elevated from a mere weapon to something far more profound. It became an object of intense philosophical, spiritual, and aesthetic veneration. The focus shifted away from the sword as a tool of war and towards the sword as a work of art and a symbol of inner purity. The great swordsmiths of the Edo period were treated like rock stars, their blades sought after not just for their cutting ability, but for their sublime beauty. A connoisseur wouldn't just look at a sword, he would study it. He would admire the jihada, the intricate wood grain-like pattern in the steel created by the repeated folding process. He would marvel at the hamon, the crystalline temper line along the blade's edge, which was unique to each sword and each smith, like a signature written in steel. The hamon could look like rolling waves or cloves of a flower or the autumn moon peeking through clouds. The creation and appreciation of the sword became a high art form. At the same time, the practice of swordsmanship itself, kenjutsu, was transformed. During the Warring States period, kenjutsu was a purely practical, no-nonsense affair. The goal was to learn how to kill your enemy as quickly and efficiently as possible on a chaotic battlefield. But in the Edo period, hundreds of new sword-fighting schools, or ryu, emerged across Japan. And while they were certainly teaching a deadly martial art, their focus became increasingly philosophical. Swordsmanship was no longer just about fighting, it was about self-perfection. It was a path to discipline, to enlightenment, to a state of egoless calm known as mushin, or no mind. The duel, the one-on-one combat between two skilled practitioners, replaced the battlefield as the ultimate test of a samurai's skill and spirit. The art of the sword became a form of moving meditation, a way to forge the soul just as the smith had forged the blade. The ultimate embodiment of this new ideal, the man who would become the most famous swordsman in all of Japanese history, was Miyamoto Musashi. If you know the name of only one samurai, it's probably his. And his life story is a perfect illustration of this shift from battlefield warrior to peacetime sword saint. Musashi was born right at the tail end of the Warring States period. He claimed to have fought at the Great Battle of Sekigahara as a young man on the losing side. After that, he became a ronin, a masterless samurai, and embarked on a personal quest, a warrior's pilgrimage, to perfect his skill with the sword. For decades, he wandered Japan, living a rough, ascetic life and fighting duels, more than 60 of them, and he never lost. His most famous duel was in 1612 against his arch-rival Sasaki Kajiro, another master swordsman. Kajiro was famous for his swallow cut, a lightning-fast downward stroke, and he wielded an unusually long sword called the drying pole. The duel was set to take place on a small island. Musashi, in a classic act of psychological warfare, showed up 3 hours late. He arrived not in formal warrior's attire, but looking disheveled, and he didn't even bother to bring his actual swords. On the boat ride over, he had carved a wooden sword, a bakken, out of a spare oar. Kajiro was enraged by this display of disrespect. He drew his famous long sword and threw his scabbard into the sea, a gesture that meant he was ready to fight to the death. Musashi calmly replied, "If you have no more use for your scabbard, you are already dead." The duel was brutally short. As Kajiro lunged, Musashi, with his oversized wooden practice sword, struck him down with a single blow to the head. He had defeated one of the greatest swordsmen in the land with a piece of wood. The story perfectly captures Musashi's philosophy. It's not the weapon that matters, but the mind of the man who wields it. He used strategy, psychology, and a deep understanding of timing and distance to win before the fight even really began. Later in life, Musashi retired from dueling. He settled down and devoted himself to art. He was a masterful ink painter and to writing. His great work, Go-Rin no Sho, or The Book of Five Rings, is one of the most famous martial arts texts ever written. But it's crucial to understand what this book is. It is not a manual for commanding armies in a Sengoku-style battle. It is a treatise on strategy, yes, but it's the strategy of personal combat, of the duel. It's about how an individual can defeat another individual through discipline, practice, and a deep understanding of the way. Musashi's life, this journey of the wandering, dueling, self-improving Ronin, became the archetype. He was the ultimate peacetime warrior, a man who sought enlightenment not on the battlefield, but through the singular pursuit of perfection in the art of the sword. He is the template for almost every cinematic samurai we know and love. But it's important to remember he was an outlier. He was a duelist, an artist, and a philosopher, not a general leading thousands of spearmen into battle. And it wasn't just the practice of swordsmanship that was being reimagined. The entire ethical code of the samurai was being written down and romanticized for the first time. This is where the famous concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, really takes shape. We tend to think of Bushido as some ancient, monolithic code that all samurai followed for 1,000 years. But that's not really true. The core values, courage, loyalty, honor, were certainly always there. But many of the most famous texts that define Bushido for a modern audience were actually written during the long peace of the Edo period. The most famous of these is the Hagakure, which translates to "in the shadow of the leaves." It was written in the early 18th century by a samurai named Yamamoto Tsunetomo. Tsunetomo had served his daimyo faithfully his entire life. When his master died, Tsunetomo wanted to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, to follow him in death, which was considered the ultimate act of loyalty. But by this point, the Tokugawa government had outlawed the practice. So Tsunetomo, forbidden from performing the warrior's death he craved, retired to a hermitage and spent years dictating his thoughts on the samurai spirit to a younger scribe. The Hagakure is a strange and fascinating book. It's filled with nostalgic, highly romanticized, and often extreme interpretations of the old warrior ethos. It's famous for its most quoted line: "The way of the samurai is found in death." For Tsunetomo, a samurai should live his life with a constant readiness to die. This willingness to throw away your life at any moment, he argued, is what gives you the freedom to act with perfect courage and loyalty. It's a powerful and poetic idea, but it's also important to remember who wrote it, a man who had never seen a real battle. Yamamoto Tsunetomo was a bureaucrat. He was writing from a place of deep nostalgia for a bloody, heroic past that he had only heard about in stories. He was, in a sense, inventing a tradition. He was looking back at the brutal, pragmatic killers of the Sengoku period and recasting them as stoic, death-seeking philosophers. The Hagakure is not a historical account of how Sengoku samurai actually behaved. It's an idealized, literary creation, written by a man in a time of peace, lamenting the fact that he was born too late. And this was happening all over Japan. A whole class of warriors with nothing to do were becoming obsessed with formalizing and philosophizing their own identity. They were taking the messy, brutal reality of their ancestors and polishing it into a beautiful, gleaming ideal. The spear, the weapon that had actually won the wars, was largely forgotten. It was a commoner's weapon, a tool of the Ashigaru. It had no romance. It had no mystique. The bow, while still respected as a traditional art, was seen as archaic. But the sword was different. It was the one thing they still had. It was the badge of their rank, the symbol of their soul. And so they poured all of their frustrated martial energy, all of their nostalgia, and all of their philosophical searching into the cult of the blade. The katana became the repository for the samurai's entire idealized identity. And this leads us to a really interesting psychological question, a paradox that sits at the heart of this entire transformation. And I want to put it to you guys. We see this massive shift. During the Sengoku period, when the samurai are actually fighting for their lives day in and day out, the weapon that dominates is the practical one, the effective one, the spear. The sword is a backup. But as soon as the wars end and they enter 2.5 centuries of peace, they build this incredibly complex, beautiful, and deadly philosophy around the sword, turning it into a symbol for their very soul. So here's the paradox. Is this process of romanticizing past violence a healthy way for a warrior culture to adapt and maintain its identity in a time of peace? Does it provide a valuable framework for discipline and self-improvement? Or is it a dangerous act of self-deception? Is it creating a beautiful but ultimately hollow philosophy that glorifies a violent reality that most of its followers will never have to face? Is it an admirable coping mechanism or a beautiful lie? I'm genuinely curious what you guys think about that. Let me know in the comments. Because this idealized, peacetime version of the samurai, this sword-wielding philosopher poet, is the version that will eventually be discovered by the West. And when that happens, the myth of the sword will conquer the world. For 265 years, the world that Tokugawa Ieyasu built was designed to be timeless. It was an intricate clockwork machine, meant to tick on, unchanged, forever. The shogunate kept the peace, the social order was frozen, and Japan turned inward, a world unto itself. But no wall is high enough to keep out the future. And in the summer of 1853, the future arrived in Edo Bay in the form of 4 massive, black-hulled steam frigates. They were American warships, commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry, and they were unlike anything the Japanese had ever seen. They could move against the wind, and they bristled with huge cannons that could have flattened the city of Edo in an afternoon. Perry carried a letter from the President of the United States demanding that Japan open its ports to trade. He promised to return in a year for an answer, with an even larger fleet, and he made it clear that no was not an option. The arrival of Perry's black ships, or Kurifune as the Japanese called them, was a national trauma. It was a technological and psychological shock of catastrophic proportions. It shattered the illusion of Japanese invincibility and exposed, in the most humiliating way possible, just how far behind the rest of the world their military technology had fallen. The country was thrown into a state of crisis and bitter debate. What should they do? Some argued for war, to repel the foreign barbarians and preserve the traditional Japanese way of life. Others, more pragmatically, argued that to resist was to risk colonization and annihilation. They contended that Japan's only hope for survival was to open up, to learn the West's technology, and to modernize as quickly as possible, so that they could one day meet the foreign powers on equal terms. This debate raged for 15 years, plunging Japan into a period of political turmoil, assassinations, and small-scale civil wars. It was a conflict that pitted the conservative forces loyal to the Tokugawa shogunate against a coalition of ambitious young samurai, mainly from the southern domains of Satsuma and Choshu, who advocated for modernization and the restoration of direct imperial rule. In 1868, the reformers won. In a brief but decisive conflict known as the Boshin War, the shogun's traditional samurai armies were soundly defeated by the smaller, but modern, rifle-equipped forces of the imperial faction. The last Tokugawa shogun abdicated, and the young Emperor Meiji was restored to power. This event, the Meiji Restoration, was not just a change of government. It was a revolution that would utterly transform every aspect of Japanese society at a dizzying, almost unimaginable speed. The goal of the new Meiji government was summarized in their slogan, Fukoku Kyohei, enrich the country, strengthen the military. They were going to build a modern, industrialized nation-state, and they were going to do it in a single generation. And to build this new Japan, they had to tear down the old one. The entire feudal system, the rigid class structure of the Edo period, was dismantled. And the first and most prominent victim of this new order was the samurai class itself. The very warriors who had led the restoration soon found that in the modern nation they were building, there was no place for them. In the 1870s, the Meiji government passed a series of edicts that stripped the samurai of their centuries-old privileges. A modern, Western-style conscript army, open to men of all social classes, was created, making the samurai's traditional role as the exclusive warrior class obsolete. Their hereditary stipends of rice, their sole source of income, were converted into government bonds and then effectively eliminated. And then came the final, most symbolic blow. In 1876, the government issued the Heitorei Edict. It banned the public wearing of swords. The daisho, the two swords that were the badge of samurai rank and the very soul of their identity for centuries, were now illegal to carry. The samurai class, as a legal and social entity, was officially dissolved. After 1,000 years, the age of the samurai was over. But here's where the story takes a fascinating and deeply ironic turn. Just as the real, living samurai was disappearing from the streets of Japan, the idea of the samurai was being resurrected, repurposed, and transformed into a powerful new tool of the state. The Meiji leaders faced a monumental challenge. They needed to unify a country that for centuries had been a collection of semi-independent domains, each with its own local loyalties. They needed to foster a new sense of national identity, a Japanese-ness that could transcend old feudal allegiances and inspire loyalty to the new, centralized government and the emperor. And what better symbol for this new national spirit than the warrior they had just abolished? They began to carefully craft a new, state-sanctioned version of Bushido. They took the romanticized, philosophical code of the Edo period, stripped it of its feudal context of loyalty to a local daimyo, and refocused it on one single, absolute principle: selfless, fanatical loyalty to the emperor and the Japanese nation. This new state Bushido emphasized discipline, sacrifice, a disdain for death, and an unbreakable Japanese spirit, or Yamato Damasha. It was a potent ideological cocktail, designed to mold the citizens of a modernizing Japan into obedient, patriotic subjects, willing to live and die for the nation. And the ultimate symbol of this new ideology was, once again, the sword. The katana, now gone from the streets, became an even more powerful symbol in the abstract. It represented the idealized martial spirit of the nation's past, a link to a golden age of courage and honor. This myth was systematically embedded into the new national education system. Japanese schoolboys were taught the romanticized tales of samurai heroes, tales that conveniently glossed over the messier realities of the Sengoku period and focused almost exclusively on the sword-wielding loyalists of the Edo mythos. This weaponization of the samurai myth reached its terrible apex in the early 20th century, as Japan itself transformed into a modern, imperial power. The officers of the new Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were all issued a mass-produced, factory-made sword called a gunto. While these were not the traditionally made, handcrafted works of art from the samurai era, they were designed to look just like a classic katana. They had the same curved, single-edged blade, the same long grip, the same round handguard. The message was clear and deliberate. The modern Japanese officer was the spiritual heir of the samurai warrior. He was carrying the soul of the nation at his hip. This sword was a direct, physical link to the glorious, idealized past. And the Bushido Code, which taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, and that death in battle for the emperor was the highest glory, became the driving ideology of the Japanese military as it carved a brutal empire across Asia and plunged into the Second World War. The romantic, peacetime myth of the sword, born from a warrior class with nothing to do, had been twisted into a justification for modern, industrial-scale slaughter. After Japan's devastating defeat in 1945, the country was occupied, demilitarized, and forced to renounce war. The state-sponsored cult of state Bushido was discredited, seen as a dangerous ideology that had led the nation to disaster. For a time, it seemed like the samurai myth might finally fade away, but it was not to be, because just as it was losing its power as a political tool in Japan, it was about to be reborn as a global cultural phenomenon. And the man who would act as its high priest was one of the greatest filmmakers who ever lived, Akira Kurosawa. In the post-war rubble of the 1950s, as Japan was rebuilding itself into a peaceful, democratic, and economic powerhouse, Kurosawa began making a series of films that would fundamentally change how the world saw Japan and how Japan saw itself. His samurai films were not like the simple, nationalistic propaganda films of the war years. They were complex, humanistic, and deeply dramatic works of art, and they were masterpieces. Films like Seven Samurai in 1954 and Yojimbo in 1961 were stunningly successful, not just in Japan, but internationally. They won major awards at film festivals in Europe and America, and they introduced a global audience to the world of the samurai for the first time. And what image of the samurai did Kurosawa present? He presented the ultimate expression of the peacetime, sword-focused ideal. His heroes were not the horse archers of the Genpei War. They were not the Ashigaru spearmen of the Sengoku Jidai. His quintessential hero was the wandering, masterless Ronin of the Edo period. He was the man defined not by his rank or his army, but by his personal skill with the sword and his individual code of honor. Think of the character played by the legendary actor Toshiro Mifune in Yojimbo. He's the nameless, cynical Ronin who walks into a town torn apart by two gangs and plays them against each other. His skill with the blade so sublime that he is an unstoppable force of nature. Kurosawa, brilliant as he was, took the myth that had been forged in the Edo period, the myth of Musashi, the myth of the duelist, the myth of the sword saint, and he perfected it. He stripped it of its toxic nationalism, made it universally human, and gave it cinematic life. He made it cool. He made it compelling. He made it iconic. And it is this cinematic image that became the definitive image. From Kurosawa, the line is direct. The myth exploded into global pop culture. The story of Seven Samurai was famously remade as the classic Western The Magnificent Seven. The Jedi Knights of Star Wars, with their laser swords, their mystical code, and their master-apprentice dynamic, are direct descendants of Kurosawa's Ronin. The myth fueled the best-selling novel Shogun by James Clavell in the 1970s, which introduced millions more to a highly romanticized version of feudal Japan. It drove the ninja and samurai craze of the 1980s in America. It inspired beloved anime and manga like Rurouni Kenshin, the story of a former assassin in the Meiji Restoration who has sworn never to kill again, wandering Japan with a reverse-bladed sword. And of course, it provides the entire foundation for modern video games like Sekiro and Ghost of Tsushima. Incredible works of art that allow players to live out the fantasy of being alone, impossibly skilled swordsmen. Each of these iterations, while often a fantastic piece of entertainment in its own right, built upon the last, reinforcing the same central, powerful idea. The samurai is the sword, and the sword is the samurai. The reality of the archer and the spearman was almost completely buried under a mountain of beautiful, compelling fiction. So, let's go all the way back to the provocative question we started with. Why were the samurai actually terrible swordsmen? The answer, of course, is that they weren't. That was just a hook. Many samurai, particularly in the long peace of the Edo period, were among the most dedicated, disciplined, and skilled swordsmen the world has ever known. The provocation of the title was simply a crowbar to pry open the popular myth and see the much richer, more complex history hiding underneath. The real story of the samurai is not the story of a single weapon or a single, unchanging warrior code. It's a story of constant, radical evolution, driven by the changing face of war and peace. It's the story of a flamboyant, aristocratic horse archer, a creature of color and individual pride. It's the story of a pragmatic, ruthless battlefield commander, leading armies of peasant spearmen in a brutal war for survival. It's the story of a peacetime bureaucrat, anxiously trying to find meaning and purpose in a world without war, pouring his soul into the art and philosophy of a blade he would never need to use. And finally, it's the story of a potent myth, a national symbol, and a global cultural icon, reshaped and reinvented by each new generation to suit its own needs. The truth of the samurai is not less interesting than the legend. It's infinitely more so. Their history is not the simple, elegant line of a sword cut. It's a messy, complicated, and deeply human story. And it is far more fascinating than the myth ever allowed. And that's where the story of why the samurai were actually terrible swordsmen comes to its dramatic close. If you enjoyed this dive into the past, do us a huge favor and hit that like button and subscribe to Beast History so you don't miss what's next. We've got so many more insane stories ready for you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.